Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Thought for the Day. I hope you're having a fantastic week so far. Tomorrow, of course, Friday, near the weekend, and we edge towards some changes. The government, of course, just a day or two ago announced some big changes to restrictions that we've been facing since the end of March, and I guess that's given you a real sense, a real lift. I hope it has as well. Obviously, we've got to be careful not to take unnecessary risks, but there's lots to look forward to over the next coming months, not least church, and we'll be saying a bit more about that fairly soon as well, but we hope to be able to give you some good news regarding church services and church community as well. But we continue with our thought for the day until that time as well. We've been thinking about covenants all this week, and we've covered quite a lot of ground. We've looked at that covenant with the world through Noah, that one-sided covenant where God promises to sustain the earth. We looked at the Abrahamic covenant with Abraham and his family, where he promised to have that land and that universal blessing, that all families will be blessed because of him. And so we carry on, and then we said yesterday, didn't we, the covenant of Sinai with Israel through Moses, and that law, the blessings and the curses that came with obedience, how they were to reflect God and be his people. And so we look at the fourth covenant in the Old Testament, the one with King David, the Davidic covenant as it's called. And it's interesting watching these covenants progress. Remember, we said they're the backbone of the biblical story. We've fast forwarded many, many years in the future. Again, we've left Sinai. Israel have gone from that nation of 12 tribes, and now they've become unified under one king, King David. Now, David is the great king of the Old Testament, the man that is after God's own heart, is said of him. The man that defeated Goliath, we mentioned him a few weeks ago in Thought for the Day. This man who, although he had lots of faults as well, remember the story of Bathsheba, but a man who was a great king who loved God and fought for the king, and fought for the King of Kings as the King of Israel. So this is what 2 Samuel says of this king when he becomes king of Israel. Chapter 5 verses 1 to 5 says, "All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel in their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel, and then you shall become their ruler.' When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. They anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. Some similarities to the life of Jesus in those numbers already. But David becomes king. He unites those 12 tribes and become one nation. This is known as the golden years between his reign and that of his son Solomon. Israel really hit the heady heights, the closest that they're ever going to be to fulfilling those covenant promises at Sinai with Moses. And here they are just doing all the things God wants. Their territory expands, they conquer their enemies, and they begin to be that unique nation of God. And so all is going well. David, like I say, has united the nation. He brings the Ark of the Covenant. There's a few mishaps along the way. He brings the Ark of the Covenant, that place where God dwells. He brings it into Jerusalem, known as the City of David. And it's that Ark of the Covenant sits under a tent pitched in Jerusalem. And David, in his cedar palace, begins to have this thought, wow, how can I sit in this palace made of wood when God lives in a tent in the city? And he has this thought and his plan. He summons prophet Nathan, and he begins to say this to him, and Nathan says, do what's on your heart. And so let me read to you a little bit of that story as well. Because as David has that plan to build a palace, a temple, I should say, for God, that's better than his own palace, the prophet Nathan has a word from God for David, and this is what he says, and I'll read this a bit long, but I'm sure you're sitting comfortably. It says, "Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I've been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people shall not oppress them any more, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. And when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. My love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom should endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So it's this wonderful moment where David makes this decision to build God a palace, God a temple, I should say, sorry. But then God says, no. I will build your house. I'm going to build you up. You are going to be a king whose throne lasts forever. The Davidic line, God promises here, will always have a king on it forever and ever and ever. And that's a really key moment. And although the word covenant isn't used here, it is used elsewhere. In 2 Samuel 23 verse 5, God reminds his people of this moment in their history. And he says this, if my house were not right with God, surely he would have not made with me an everlasting covenant. And there are other verses as well that refer to this moment in Israel's history as a time when God made a covenant with Israel. And that covenant is that there will be a king on Israel's throne, not just for a little while, but forever and ever and ever. That a Davidic king from the line of David will rule the world forever and ever and ever, an everlasting kingdom and kingship. And actually, that promise of that king who will last forever actually begins to fulfill those other covenants and those other key moments in salvation history. Adam and Eve, I should say, were meant to rule over the world and keep it for God. And that kind of universal rule is now going to be realized by this Davidic king who will come in the future. The promise of Abraham's offspring that will have this land and this blessing that will be universal is going to be secured for us actually through this king that will come after David, a son of David whose rule will have no end. And those great blessings hidden and spoken of in the Sinai covenant actually will be fulfilled because this king will be on the throne and who will be perfect, who will be sinless and who will rule with faithfulness and justice and who will obey God in a way that no other Israelite has. And this is an unconditional covenant. God makes this promise to David, not that he will have a long rule, but that someone from his line will rule forever and ever and ever. And actually what's really incredible is you go through the pages of the Old Testament, there begins to be a new expectancy of a Messiah, of an anointed one, of a king, a Davidic king in the line of David, who will come, a son of David, who will come to rule forever and ever and ever. And so these covenants have linked together. And by the time we get to the end of the Old Testament, there's this real clear expectancy that someone, this figure, this king is going to come, who's going to fulfill all of God's promises, bring the whole story together. And that's when we get to the most important covenant of them all and the most important person of them all. But that's for tomorrow. So I'll see you then. God bless.